Her cry broke into the night like a rifle shot. It was sharp, hollow, and it tore through the stillness of the empty prairie. "No one will accept me with my children," she whispered, and the words were like splinters in her throat. Two little girls, one 4, one 5, clung to her worn skirt. They didn't understand the words, but they felt the weight behind them. They felt the tremble in their mother's body. Out here, with no roof but a sea of cold stars, she believed those words were true. The road behind her was a graveyard of hope. Every town, every ranch, every face had been a closed door. The last one was a rancher, a man with shoulders as broad as a barn and a heart narrower than a snake's eye. He'd spoken of a home, of warmth, of safety. Then he saw the children. His voice went hard. He muttered something about mouths to feed, about the cost of things, about needing a woman who was free. But the truth was in his eyes. He didn't see a woman of strength. He saw a burden, multiplied by 2. She watched him ride away, his silhouette shrinking into the dust, and every hoofbeat felt like a nail in her coffin. Her daughters, bless their hearts, asked no questions. The younger one just pressed a sticky hand into hers. The older one wrapped her arms around her mother's waist, a tiny soldier guarding her against a world of cruel men. Their innocence was a blade that cut deeper than any insult. She carried stories in her blood, stories of her people, of rivers that sang and mountains that spoke. But this new world didn't care for old stories. It looked at her buckskin dress, her dark braids, and the faded beads woven into them, and it saw only one thing: a problem, another, something that didn't belong. So at night she told her own stories to her girls, tales of coyote spirits and silver-backed snakes that slithered through the canyons. She spoke of mothers who were fierce like the storm and who never, ever left their children. Her words were a blanket, tucking them into sleep. But she stayed awake, staring at a sky that was too big, too empty, wondering if there was a place left on this earth for them to rest. At dawn, they walked into another town. The wooden buildings stood like silent judges. Eyes peered from behind dusty curtains. She saw them. She always saw them. She went into the general store, her girls trailing behind her like little shadows. She offered the shopkeeper a bracelet of beads, a pattern her grandmother had taught her, her last beautiful thing. She asked only for a little flower. The shopkeeper just shook his head. His lips were a thin, mean line. "Too many mouths," he muttered, not even looking at her. He was looking at her children. She didn't argue. She just gathered her daughters and stepped back into the harsh sunlight. Her heart felt like a stone, but she kept her head high. She had to. Her girls were watching. They were always watching. And that's when she saw him. He was just a man, leaning against a post outside the store. His hat was pulled down low, shading his eyes. But she could feel his gaze. It wasn't pity. It wasn't scorn. It was still, quiet, like a deep pool of water. His clothes were dusty, his boots were scarred, but there was something about him that was different from all the others. He wasn't looking at her like a burden. He was just looking. She looked away fast, pulling her girls closer. Hope was a dangerous thing, a wild animal that could turn and bite you. Still, the image of him stayed with her, like the hum of a plucked string long after the music stops. That evening, she made a small camp at the edge of town, far enough away for privacy. She built a tiny fire, a fragile circle of light in an ocean of darkness. Her daughters curled up against her, their soft breaths a rhythm against her aching ribs. And for the first time in weeks, she let herself cry. She hid her face in her hands so the girls wouldn't see. "No one will accept me with my children," she whispered again, this time to the fire, to the night. The smoke carried her words up into the darkness, and she felt completely, utterly alone. The fire crackled, as if it was weeping with her. Then she heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Not the sound of a threat, but the sound of purpose. She went rigid, her arms instantly wrapping around her sleeping girls. A shadow fell over their camp. Into the firelight stepped the cowboy from the store. He didn't say a word. He just crouched down, moving with a quiet grace. He placed a canteen of water and a whole loaf of fresh bread on the ground beside her. The firelight danced across his face, carving it out of amber and shadow. His eyes were steady, solid as a river stone. He didn't look at her with pity. He didn't look away in shame. He just looked at her. His hand brushed against hers as he set the bread down. It wasn't a grab, it wasn't a demand. It was just a touch, an offering, a bridge being built across a dark canyon. She met his gaze, and her heart did a painful stutter step in her chest. Fear and hope waged a war inside her. Her daughters stirred in their sleep, unaware that the whole world had just shifted on its axis. And in that moment, with her desperate confession still hanging in the smoky air, she realized something. The path she was on, the one she thought ended in a lonely grave, might not be so lonely after all. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. He didn't move. He just stayed there, at the edge of her light, his presence a silent answer to the question she had been screaming into the void. She watched him, her breath caught in her throat. The night held its breath with her, waiting to see what she would do next. The sun came up soft and gold, spilling light over their small camp. She hadn't slept. Not a wink. The stranger, the cowboy, had stayed through the entire night. He sat just beyond the fire's dying embers, a silent guardian. His hat was tipped low, his breathing slow and even. He hadn't intruded. He hadn't demanded anything. He had simply remained. When her younger girl Maya woke up, she saw him first. She blinked her big dark eyes and a slow smile spread across her face. She crawled out from under her mother's arm and toddled over to him. In her small, dirt-caked hand, she held a crooked wildflower she'd picked the day before. She held it up to him, a silent offering of her own. The cowboy moved with surprising gentleness. He took the flower from her as if it were a priceless jewel. He carefully tucked the stem into the leather band of his hat. Maya giggled, a sound like tiny bells, and leaned against his knee. Ilara watched, and felt something inside her chest begin to thaw. It was a feeling so foreign, so fragile, she was afraid to even name it. He stayed with them all day. He didn't talk much, but his actions spoke volumes. He fetched water from the town well, carrying the heavy bucket for her. He saw her trying to mend her dress with clumsy fingers and quietly produced a needle and thread from his saddlebag. He even traded some of his jerky for the beaded bracelet she offered, giving her far more than it was worth. For the girls, he was a miracle. He took out a small knife and whittled 2 reeds into perfect little whistles. Soon, the air was filled with their clumsy, happy toots and shrieks of laughter. It was a sound Ilara hadn't heard in so long, a sound without fear attached to it. But the town was watching. Oh, they were always watching. When she walked to the well, the whispers followed her like flies. When the cowboy carried a sack of flour back from the store for her, the stares were like daggers in her back. The men in town called him a fool, their voices laced with scorn. The women looked at her with a venomous mix of pity and contempt, as if she were a thief who had stolen something that didn't belong to her. The cowboy never responded. He didn't seem to hear them. His silence wasn't weakness, she realized. It was a wall, a fortress. He was refusing to let their poison touch him or her. His stillness was a shield, and she slowly, cautiously, began to huddle behind it. She watched him, waiting for the change. She'd seen it before. The moment when kindness soured into impatience. The moment a man realized the weight of her life, of her children, and turned away. It was always just a matter of time, but with him the moment never came. He remained as steady as the northern star. Then the past came riding back into town. It was the rancher, Jebediah, the one who had turned her away with such casual cruelty. He swaggered down the dusty street, his spurs jingling, and his eyes landed on her. A cruel, smug smile spread across his face. Then his gaze flicked to the cowboy standing beside her. His voice was loud, meant to carry. "Well, look what we have here," he boomed, a nasty glint in his eyes. "Looks like Silas found himself some charity work." A small crowd of loafers started to gather, sensing a spectacle. Jebediah spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dust, dangerously close to her feet. "Taking in scraps no one else wants, Silas? A buckskin burden with 2 little pups trailing behind her." The men around him chuckled. The sound was dry and brittle, like dead leaves skittering across the ground. Ilara froze. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. She grabbed her daughters, pulling them behind her skirt. The old familiar shame rose up in her throat, hot and choking. She knew this moment. She had lived it 100 times in 100 different towns. The pointing, the laughing, the humiliation of being seen as less than human. She squeezed her eyes shut, ready to turn, to flee, to disappear back into the wilderness where the only judgment came from the wind and the rain. But before she could move, the cowboy stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words were low, but they cut through the laughter like a razor. "The only thing I see here, Jebediah," he said, his voice like iron, "is a blind man." The crowd went quiet. The cowboy took another step, placing himself directly between her and the rancher. "You look at this woman and you see a burden," he continued, his gaze never leaving Jebediah's face. "I look at her and I see a strength you couldn't comprehend in 1,000 years. What you call scraps are blessings, and any man who would turn away from that kind of heart isn't a man at all." Jebediah's smug grin faltered. Anger flared in his eyes, but for once in his life, he was speechless. The crowd shifted, their amusement turning to unease. They had come for a show, but this was something else entirely. For the first time since her husband had died, a man had spoken for her. Not out of pity, but out of respect. And Ilara could barely breathe. They left town just as the sun began to bleed across the horizon. The girls ran ahead, their little legs scrambling down the path toward the river, excited by the promise of splashing in the cool water. Ilara followed more slowly, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and a terrifying, fragile hope. The cowboy, Silas, walked beside her. He was silent again, the quiet guardian. He seemed to know she needed the space to process what had just happened. They reached the river's edge, and the sound of the girls' laughter filled the air as they tossed pebbles into the current. Ilara watched them, a fierce love swelling in her chest. Then she looked down at her own trembling hands. The old fear, the one that lived in her bones, began to rise again. It was a familiar poison. "No one will accept me with my children," she whispered. The words came out on a choked breath. It wasn't a cry for help this time. It was a statement of fact, a truth that had been carved into her soul by years of rejection. She said it to the river, to the setting sun, to anyone but him. It was the wall she put up to protect herself, the final, unbreakable barrier. She expected him to say nothing. She expected him to nod sadly and, eventually, to walk away. Every man did. Instead, she felt his hand cover hers. His touch was warm, firm, and it stilled the trembling in her fingers. She risked a glance up at him. His eyes were on her, and there was an intensity in them that stole her breath. "You're wrong," he said, his voice soft but absolute. "You think they are the reason men turn away? You're wrong." He paused, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "Any man who sees them as a burden isn't a man you'd want anyway. A real man. A real man sees them, and knows he's looking at everything that matters. His words hit her with the force of a physical blow. They were the words she had longed to hear her entire life, the words she had given up all hope of ever hearing. Then he did something that shattered her completely. He turned from her, walked to the water's edge, and knelt down so he was eye level with her daughters. Lena and Maya stopped their playing and looked at him, their faces curious. He just smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his rugged face. "Mind if an old cowboy joins you?" he asked them. They squealed with delight and launched themselves at him, wrapping their small arms around his neck in a tangle of limbs and giggles. He caught them easily, pulling them into a hug, and for a moment the three of them were a perfect, complete picture. They belonged. The sound of the river faded away. The whole world seemed to go silent. Tears streamed down Alara's face, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, so profound it was painful. She had seen her children as anchors, weights that dragged her down into a lonely abyss. But this man saw them as treasure. He hadn't chosen her in spite of them. He had chosen her, it seemed, because of them. The sun sank lower, painting the water in hues of orange and deep purple. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird beating its wings against a cage. He stood up, her daughters clinging to his hands, and walked back to her. He took her free hand and placed it flat against his chest. She could feel the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. His eyes, dark and serious, locked onto hers. "Forever," he said, the word a low rumble in his chest. "With you. And with them." The words sank into the dry, cracked earth of her soul like a life-giving rain. She felt the fear, the bitterness, the despair that had been her constant companions for so long begin to crack and fall away. The sky filled with stars, the river whispered its ancient song, and as the sound of her children's laughter wrapped around them like a warm blanket, she finally allowed herself to believe. The loneliness was over. A new story was just beginning, but the past wasn't done with them, not by a long shot. What she didn't know was that Jebediah wasn't just a cruel rancher, and Silas wasn't just a kind cowboy. They were both pieces in a much larger, much more dangerous game, and she and her daughters were standing right in the middle of it. The promise of forever felt warm and real as they made their camp by the river. Silas was different now. The silence was still there, but it was a comfortable, shared quiet. He showed the girls how to find constellations in the sprawling night sky, his deep voice naming the hunter and the bear. Ilara watched, a fragile peace settling over her. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving the night, she was living it. But as her girls finally drifted off to sleep, nestled between them, Silas grew serious. He looked at her, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "Ilara," he began, and the sound of her name on his lips was both intimate and startling. How did he know her name? She had never told him. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. "Jebediah," Silas continued, his voice low. "He didn't just recognize you, did he?" She shook her head, unable to speak. The old fear was creeping back in. "He called you by another name in town," Silas said. "A name I haven't heard in 10 years. He called you Little Dove." Ilara flinched as if struck. That was her father's name for her. No one had called her that since the night of the fire, the night everything was taken from her, the night her husband was killed and she was forced to run with her babies into the darkness. "How?" she stammered, her voice a raw whisper. "How do you know that name?" Silas looked away from her, into the dancing flames. His jaw was tight. "Because I was there." The world tilted. The crackling of the fire sounded like roaring in her ears. "There? Where?" "At Blackwood Creek," he said, his voice heavy with a guilt she couldn't understand. The night of the fire. The night your father's ranch was burned to the ground. The night Samuel died. Samuel, her husband. Hearing his name from this stranger's lips was a violation. She scrambled backwards, away from him, pulling her sleeping children with her. The peace of the evening shattered into a million sharp pieces. Who was this man? "You were there?" she hissed, her hand instinctively going to the small knife she kept hidden in her boot. "Who are you?" "My name is Silas Kane," he said, finally meeting her terrified gaze. "And my father is the man who ordered the attack." The confession hung in the air between them, more shocking than a gunshot. Silas Kane, son of Marcus Kane, the ruthless land baron who had been buying up the whole valley, using fear and violence as his currency. Marcus Kane was the man who had wanted her father's land, the land that held the only freshwater spring for 50 miles. The man her father had refused to sell to. The man she knew, deep in her gut, was responsible for her husband's murder. This man, this kind, gentle man who had defended her, who had made her children laugh, who had promised her forever. He was the son of her greatest enemy, the serpent in her garden. "You lied to me," she whispered, the betrayal a fresh, gaping wound. "Everything. It was a lie." "No," he said, his voice raw with urgency. "Elara, listen to me. I'm not him. I left my father's house that night. I turned my back on his money, his name, everything. I've spent the last 10 years trying to find a way to atone for what he did." "Atone?" she spat, the word tasting like ash. "My husband is dead. My children are fatherless. We have nothing. How do you atone for that?" "By finding the one thing that can stop him," Silas said, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity. "By finding the proof. The original Spanish land grant that proves your family owns the spring, not him. Your father told everyone he had it hidden somewhere safe. Marcus has been tearing the valley apart for a decade looking for it. That's why Jebediah was so interested in you. He works for my father. He recognized you. He knows if anyone knows where that grant is, it's you." Suddenly it all made sense. The way Silas had watched her in town, his chance appearance at her camp, his defense against Jebediah. It wasn't kindness. It was a mission. He hadn't been looking at a woman to love. He'd been looking for a weapon to use against his own father. Her heart, which had just started to heal, broke all over again. "So that's what this is," she said, her voice flat and dead. "You want the grant. You want to use me and my children to fight your family's war." "I want to see justice done," he insisted, taking a step toward her. "I want to give you back what he stole from you." "Stay away from me," she warned, her hand now gripping the hilt of her knife. "Stay away from my children." He stopped, his face a mask of anguish. "Elara, you're not safe. Now that Jebediah has found you, my father will know. He will send men. They won't stop until they get what they want. They will take your girls if they have to." The threat, vile and real, hung in the air. She knew he was right. Marcus Kane was a monster who wouldn't hesitate. She looked down at the innocent faces of her sleeping daughters. She had run for 10 years to keep them safe. Now, the past had finally caught up. She was trapped. Trapped by her history, trapped by her enemy, and trapped by the son of that enemy, who now claimed to be her only hope. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping hands. She looked at Silas, the man who had offered her a dream and then revealed it was built on a nightmare. Could she trust him? Could she afford not to? The prairie, which had felt so vast and open just hours before, now felt like the walls of a cage, closing in on her and her children from all sides. And she had no idea which way to turn. The tension by the fire was thick enough to choke on. Elara held Silas's gaze, her mind racing. He was the son of a devil, but he spoke of justice. Was it a trick? Another, more elaborate lie to get what he wanted? Or was he truly a man trying to escape the shadow of his father? "The grant," she said, her voice hard. "You think I have it." "I think you know where it is," he corrected gently. "Your father was a smart man. He wouldn't have kept it on him. He would have entrusted it to the person he loved most. He would have made sure you knew how to find it, even if you didn't know what you were looking for." He was right. Her father had been a man of secrets and symbols. On the night of the fire, as the flames licked the sky, he had pushed her out a back window, pressing a small, heavy object into her hand. "Never lose this, little dove," he'd gasped, his face smeared with soot and blood. "It sings the song of our home. Follow the song when the time is right." She had thought he was delirious from the smoke. In her terror and grief, she had clutched the object, run, and never looked back. She still had it, tucked away in the lining of her travel pack. It was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a dove. She'd always assumed it was just a sentimental trinket. "The song of our home," she murmured, the memory surfacing like a ghost. Silas's eyes widened. "What did you say?" She looked at him, suspicion warring with a desperate need for an ally. Could she risk it? Could she trust him with the one secret she had left? Before she could answer, a twig snapped in the darkness behind them. Instantly, Silas was on his feet, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. He moved with a speed and certainty that was terrifying. This wasn't just a cowboy. This was a man who knew violence. He pushed Alara and the still sleeping girls behind him, positioning himself between them and the sound. "Who's there?" Silas called out, his voice a low growl that echoed in the silent night. Silence. The only sound was the river and the pounding of Alara's own heart. Then a voice drifted out of the trees, a familiar, hateful voice. "Now, is that any way to greet an old friend, Silas?" Jebediah stepped out of the darkness, but he wasn't alone. Two other men, rough-looking and armed with rifles, fanned out on either side of him. Jebediah had a smug, triumphant look on his face. He'd followed them from town. "Your father sends his regards," Jebediah said, his eyes glinting in the firelight. He ignored Silas and looked straight at Alara. "He's very eager to be reunited with his property. Seems you've been holding on to something of his." "She has nothing that belongs to him," Silas said, his body tense as a coiled snake. "Turn around and ride out, Jebediah. This doesn't have to get ugly." Jebediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Oh, I think it does. See, Marcus is tired of waiting. He gave me simple instructions. Get the grant, and if the woman or her pups get in the way, dispose of them." The threat was naked, brutal. Alara clutched her children, her blood running cold. Maya stirred, murmuring in her sleep. "You'll have to come through me," Silas said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "That was always the plan," Jebediah sneered. "Your father's tired of you too, you little traitor. He said to tell you, family business stays in the family." And then all hell broke loose. Jebediah and his men raised their rifles, but Silas was faster. He drew his pistol in a blur of motion, the gunshot exploding through the night. One of Jebediah's men crumpled to the ground before he even got a shot off. The second man fired, the bullet whining past Silas's head, close enough for Alara to feel the heat. Silas dove for cover behind a cluster of rocks, firing back. The night erupted into a chaos of muzzle flashes, shouting, and the terrifying sound of splintering wood as bullets slammed into the trees around them. Alara dragged her now awake and screaming daughters low to the ground, trying to shield them with her own body. This was her nightmare come to life. The fire, the violence, the smell of gunpowder. It was happening all over again. She saw Jebediah circling around, trying to get a clear shot at Silas from the side. But he wasn't looking at Silas. He was looking at her. He knew Silas wouldn't risk a fight if the children were in the line of fire. He was using them as a shield, a distraction. He raised his rifle, taking aim not at her, but at her oldest daughter, Lena. Time slowed down. She saw the cold, determined look in his eyes. She saw the dark hole of the rifle barrel. She saw her daughter's terrified face. There was no choice. With a scream of pure rage, Alara shoved her children aside, grabbed the heaviest branch from the fire, and charged. She didn't think. She just reacted. A mother protecting her young. She swung the burning log like a club, aiming for Jebediah's head. He turned at the last second, surprised by her ferocity. The flaming end of the branch caught him across the face. He howled in pain and fury, staggering back, dropping his rifle. His face was a mess of burns and ash. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a murderous hatred. "You'll pay for that," he snarled, pulling a long hunting knife from his belt. But his moment of distraction had cost him. Silas took the opportunity, firing his last shot. The bullet hit Jebediah's remaining man, who went down with a grunt. Now it was just them. Silas, Alara, and a wounded, enraged Jebediah. Silas's gun was empty. Jebediah knew it. He grinned, a horrific sight on his burned face, and started advancing on Alara, the knife held low. "I'm going to enjoy this," he growled. Silas shouted her name, scrambling for more bullets, but he was too far away. It was just her and the monster. Her children were crying, huddled by the riverbank. She stood her ground, the smoldering branch her only weapon. This was it, the end of the road. But then, something happened that no one could have predicted. Her youngest daughter, Maya, who had been silent with terror, suddenly pointed a trembling finger past Jebediah toward the dark river. "Shadow Man," she whimpered. "The Shadow Man is coming." Alara and Jebediah both froze, turning to look. For a second, there was nothing but the black, swirling water. Then, a figure rose from the river. It wasn't a man. It was something else. Tall, silent, draped in what looked like wet furs and river moss. Its face was obscured by shadow, but two eyes seemed to glow with a faint, pale light. It moved without a sound, gliding over the water toward the shore, toward them. It was a figure from her people's oldest, darkest stories. A river spirit, a guardian, or a demon. Jebediah, for all his bluster, was terrified. He let out a choked gasp, his face draining of all color. He forgot about Alara, forgot about the knife. He was staring at the impossible thing emerging from the water. This was her chance. While Jebediah was frozen in superstitious terror, Alara acted. She gripped her branch and lunged not at him but at his dropped rifle. Her fingers closed around the cool wood and metal. She didn't know much about guns, but her husband had shown her enough. She raised the rifle, the barrel heavy and awkward in her hands, and pointed it straight at Jebediah's chest. "Get away from my children," she said, her voice shaking but filled with deadly resolve. The river creature continued its silent advance. It was almost to the bank now. The air grew cold, and a strange, low humming sound seemed to emanate from the being. Jebediah was trapped between two horrors, a furious mother with a rifle, and a nightmare from the depths of the river. He made his choice. With a terrified scream, he turned and scrambled away, crashing through the undergrowth and disappearing into the night. The clearing fell silent. The river creature stood at the water's edge for a long moment, its pale eyes seeming to fix on Alara. It gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then, just as silently as it appeared, it sank back into the black water and was gone. Alara stood there, shaking, the heavy rifle still in her hands. Her children were safe. The immediate danger was gone. Silas slowly approached, his own gun now reloaded. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the spot where the creature had disappeared, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. "What was that?" he breathed. "A story," Alara whispered, her heart still hammering. "An old story my grandmother used to tell me. She said the spirits of the river protect our bloodline." She looked down at her daughter Maya, who was now clutching her leg. "You saw him before, didn't you, my love? In your dreams?" Maya nodded, her eyes wide. The shadow man watches. It wasn't just a child's nightmare. It was a memory, a warning, a protector that had been with them all along. The fight was over, but the war had just begun. Jebediah had escaped. He would go back to Marcus Kane and tell him everything. They knew where she was, and they knew she was the key. But something had changed. Alara was no longer just a victim running from her past. She had fought back. She had faced a monster and won. And she had an ally. A complicated, dangerous ally, but an ally nonetheless. And apparently, she had others. Guardians she didn't even know existed. She looked at Silas, then down at the rifle in her hands. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Something hard and sharp. Resolve. "He's right," she said to Silas, her voice clear and strong. "My father did give me something. A key. He told me it sings the song of our home." She reached into her pack and pulled out the carved wooden dove. It felt heavy, significant, in her palm. "We're not running anymore," she declared. "We're going to find this song. And then, we're going to take everything back." The fire had burned down to glowing coals. The dead men lay still in the shadows, and under the vast, starry sky, a hunted woman and the son of her enemy made a pact to finish a war that had started 10 years ago, with no idea that the path ahead was darker and more twisted than anything they had yet survived. The first rays of dawn found them burying the bodies. It was grim work, but necessary. They couldn't leave a trace for Marcus Kane's other men to find. Silas worked with a grim efficiency that spoke of a past he hadn't shared, while Alara kept the children close, murmuring stories to calm their frayed nerves. The silence between her and Silas was different now. The betrayal was still a raw wound, but the shared violence had forged a new, fragile bond between them. They were no longer a potential family, they were soldiers in the same war. When the work was done, Silas wiped the dirt from his hands and looked at her. "The wooden dove," he said. "The song of your home. It's a riddle." Alara nodded, turning the carving over in her hands. She had stared at it for a decade, seeing only a piece of wood. Now, she looked at it with new eyes. It was intricate, covered in tiny symbols she'd never truly noticed before. Markings that matched the patterns on her grandmother's bracelet. "My father was a builder," she said, thinking aloud. "He built our house, our barn. He even built the little chapel in the valley." Silas's eyes lit up. "The chapel? St. James's? It's been abandoned for years, ever since the big earthquake." "The earthquake," Alara whispered. "That was just a few months before the fire. He was so proud of that chapel. He said he built it to withstand anything. He said it was a house of secrets." A house of secrets, a bird that sings the song of home. It was starting to connect. "The grant isn't in a box," Silas said, his voice filled with dawning realization. "It's not buried. It's in something. Something he built." "The chapel," she finished for him. The place was miles from their old ranch, in a secluded part of the valley. It was the last place anyone would think to look. But there was a problem. A big one. "The chapel is on the other side of Blackwood Ridge," Silas said, his face growing grim. "And the only way through the pass is a town called Redemption." Alara's heart sank. She knew of Redemption. It wasn't really a town. It was a fortress. It was the headquarters of Marcus Kane's entire operation, a place crawling with his hired guns, run by a sheriff on his payroll. Walking in there would be walking into the lion's den. "We can't go around," Silas added, anticipating her question. "The ridge is impassable this time of year. It's Redemption, or we don't go at all." "They'll be looking for us," Alara said. "Jebediah will have told them everything. Our faces will be known." "I know," Silas said, "which is why we're not going in as us." He went to his saddlebags and pulled out a bundle. Inside were clothes, a simple worn dress for her, far different from her buckskin, small trousers and shirts for the girls, and for himself, the plain, dusty attire of a simple farmer. But there was something else, a small sealed jar of dark liquid and a pair of shears. "Your braids," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "They mark you. They tell the story of your people. But right now, that story will get you killed. We need to look like everyone else. Just another family passing through, looking for work." Alara stared at him, her hand instinctively going to the long, thick braids that fell over her shoulders. Her hair was her history, her connection to her mother, her grandmother, to a lineage of strong women. Cutting it felt like cutting off a part of her soul. It was another thing this war was trying to steal from her. She looked at her daughters, their innocent faces still shadowed with the fear of the previous night. She would do anything to protect them. She would burn her own history to the ground to give them a future. She took a deep breath, picked up the shears, and with a single resolute motion, cut through the first braid. It fell to the ground like a dead snake. The sense of loss was sharp, immediate. But as she looked at Silas, she saw not triumph, but a deep, shared sorrow in his eyes. He understood what he was asking her to sacrifice. They transformed themselves by the river. Her long hair was cut short, crudely, and dyed a flat, muddy brown with the liquid from the jar. She put on the drab dress, feeling like a stranger in her own skin. The girls were changed too, their vibrant clothes replaced with muted colors. They looked like little ghosts. Silas altered his own appearance, shaving his beard and changing his hat. When they were done, they were unrecognizable. A poor Dust Bowl family, unremarkable and easily overlooked. The perfect disguise. "There's an old supply wagon that heads into Redemption every morning from the crossroads," Silas explained. "The driver is a man named Elias. He's not on my father's payroll. He owes me a favor. He'll get us inside the gates." It was a risky, desperate plan, but it was their only plan. As they packed their few belongings, Lena, her oldest, came to her, clutching the cut braids in her small hands. "Mama," she whispered, her eyes full of confusion. "Why did you break your hair?" Ilara knelt down, pulling her daughter into a hug. "Sometimes, my love," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We have to hide the light to keep the fire from going out. But we never forget the flame. I promise." She took one of the faded beads from the end of a braid and tucked it deep into Lena's pocket, a secret reminder of who they were. They met Elias at the crossroads as planned. He was a gnarled old man with eyes that had seen too much. He didn't ask questions, just nodded at Silas and gestured for them to hide in the back of his wagon, under a pile of canvas and empty sacks. The journey was tense and suffocating. Peeking through a small hole in the canvas, Alara saw the landscape change. The open prairie gave way to rocky hills, and then she saw it. Redemption. It wasn't a town. It was a scar on the land, a dirty, sprawling collection of rough-hewn buildings, all surrounded by a high wooden palisade. Guards with rifles patrolled the top of the wall. This was Marcus Kane's kingdom. The wagon rumbled up to the main gate. Alara held her breath, her arms wrapped tightly around her daughters. She could hear the guards talking to Elias. Their voices were rough, suspicious. "Just the usual," Elias grumbled. "Flour, salt pork, your boss is eating well." "Who's that in the back?" one of the guards demanded. His voice was sharp. He'd seen something. "Just my daughter and her kids," Elias lied smoothly. "Her husband ran off, bringing him to my sister. Got a problem with that?" There was a long, agonizing pause. Ilara could feel the guard's suspicion like a physical weight. She prepared herself for the canvas to be ripped away, for the shouting, for the guns. Then the guard grunted. "Fine. Move along, old man, and tell your daughter to keep her brats quiet. The sheriff's in a foul mood today." The wagon lurched forward, and they were inside. They were in the belly of the beast. The wagon clattered through the muddy streets of Redemption. Peeking through the canvas, Ilara saw a town simmering with barely controlled violence. Rough men with guns on their hips swaggered in and out of a loud saloon. The faces were hard, cruel. This was a place with no law but Marcus Kane. Elias pulled the wagon into a stable behind the general store. "This is as far as I go," the old man whispered, his eyes darting around nervously. "The chapel's on the east side of town, but be careful. Sheriff Thorne is Kane's dog, and his bite is worse than his bark. He's been turning the town upside down all morning." "Jebediah," Silas muttered. "He made it back." "He came in an hour ago," Elias confirmed. "Looked like he'd wrestled with a bobcat and lost. He went straight to the sheriff's office. Now they're offering a bounty. $1,000 for a native woman and her 2 girls. $1,000. The price on their heads. Every single person in this town was now a potential enemy. "Thank you, Elias," Silas said, pressing a few coins into the old man's hand. "We won't forget this." "Just get what you came for and get out," Elias grumbled, turning away. "This place eats people like you for breakfast." They slipped out of the stable and into a narrow, filthy alleyway. The stench was awful. The girls huddled close, their eyes wide with fear. Ilara's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every distant shout sounded like a discovery. "We need to blend in, act natural," Silas whispered, his hand resting on her lower back, a small, reassuring pressure. "We'll make our way to the chapel, but we do it slowly. We look like we belong." They stepped out onto the main street. It was a terrifying experience. Men turned to look at them, their gazes lingering. Ilara kept her head down, focusing on her children, trying to project an aura of weary resignation, just another down-on-her-luck mother. A large man with a star pinned to his chest stepped out of the sheriff's office. He was tall and broad, with a cruel, thin mouth and cold, dead eyes. Sheriff Thorne. He scanned the street, his eyes sweeping over them for a moment before moving on. He hadn't recognized them. The disguises were holding. As they neared the far end of the street, they saw the chapel. It stood on a slight rise, set apart from the other buildings. It was a simple stone structure, but even from a distance, Ilara could see the damage from the earthquake. A large crack ran up one side of the bell tower, and several roof tiles were missing. It looked forgotten, derelict. Perfect. But there was a problem. 2 of Kane's men were stationed at the bottom of the path leading up to it. They were lounging, smoking, their rifles leaning against the fence. "Why would they guard an abandoned chapel?" Ilara whispered. "My father's thorough," Silas replied, his voice tight. "When he couldn't find the grant, he must have started sealing off any place connected to your family. He knows it's somewhere. He just doesn't know where." They couldn't just walk past the guards. They were trapped. Then a commotion erupted from the saloon. 2 men stumbled out, shouting and throwing clumsy punches. A crowd quickly gathered to watch the drunken brawl. Sheriff Thorne and his deputies moved toward the noise, their attention completely focused on the fight. "This is our chance," Silas hissed. "The guards will be watching the fight. We can circle around the back. Go now." He grabbed their hands and pulled them into the shadow of a blacksmith shop. They moved quickly, using the distraction to their advantage. They crept along the back of the buildings, staying low, their hearts in their throats. They reached the back of the chapel grounds, where the fence was broken. They slipped through and found themselves in an overgrown cemetery. Old weathered tombstones stood like crooked teeth in the tall grass. The back of the chapel was dark, imposing. "The riddle," Silas said, his eyes scanning the stone walls. "The dove sings the song of our home." Ilara looked at the carved bird in her hand. Then she looked at the chapel. Her father had been a stonemason as well as a carpenter. His work always had a signature, a small personal mark. She began to search the stones near the foundation, running her fingers over the rough surfaces. And then she found it. Tucked away, almost hidden by weeds, was a single stone with a carving on it. It was a dove in flight, identical to the one she held in her hand. Here, she breathed. Silas knelt beside her. The stone looked solid, part of the wall, but as he examined it, he saw a faint, almost invisible seam around it. It wasn't a carving. It was a keyhole, a specially made one. Ilara looked at the wooden bird. The tail of the bird was carved into a strange, angular shape. It wasn't a likeness. It was a key. With trembling hands, she inserted the bird's tail into the carved opening on the stone. It fit perfectly. She turned it. There was a deep, grinding sound from within the wall. The stone block receded into the darkness, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a thick, yellowed document sealed with wax. The Spanish land grant. They had it. They actually had it. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made her dizzy washed over Ilara. The proof, the key to her home, her future, her children's legacy. She reached into the dark space to grab it, and a hand grabbed her wrist. A strong, cold hand shot out of the darkness of the compartment and seized her in an iron grip. Ilara screamed. Before Silas could react, a section of the chapel wall swung inwards, revealing a hidden passage. A man stepped out, dragging Ilara with him. He was huge, scarred, and wore the uniform of a high-ranking officer in Kane's private army. And behind him, standing in the shadows of the secret tunnel, was a well-dressed, silver-haired man with eyes as cold and gray as a winter storm. Marcus Kane. "Thank you for bringing me my key, little dove," Marcus Kane said, his voice a silken threat. He gestured to the two guards who had appeared at the mouth of the tunnel behind him. They grabbed the children. "And Silas," he said, a cruel smile touching his lips as he looked at his son. "It's so good to have the whole family back together." It had all been a trap. The secret passage, the guards at the front, the fight in the street. All of it. A perfectly orchestrated trap, and they had walked right into it. "You knew," Silas said, his voice choked with fury and despair as he stared at his father. "You knew we were coming." Marcus Kane chuckled, a dry, reptilian sound. "Of course I knew. Jebediah is a fool, but he is a useful one. He told me you'd survived, and I know my son. I knew you'd seek out the girl. I knew you'd think yourself clever, and I knew you'd eventually lead me right here." He took the wooden dove from Ilara's hand, turning it over with a look of triumph. "I've been searching this chapel for 10 years, tearing it apart stone by stone, but I never found the lock. It seems I didn't have the key." He then took the land grant from the compartment and tucked it into his coat pocket. "And now I have both." Ilara struggled against the man holding her, her eyes wild with panic as she looked at her daughters. Lena and Maya were crying, held firmly by Kane's men. "Let them go!" she screamed. "This is between you and me. The children are innocent." "Innocence is a luxury no one in my world can afford," Kane said dismissively. He looked at Silas, his expression hardening. "As for you, my disappointing son, you've chosen your side. You chose this squalor over your own blood. A foolish, sentimental choice, and it will be your last." He gave a sharp nod to the man holding Ilara. The man twisted her arm behind her back, producing a knife and holding it to her throat. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't end this right now," Marcus said to Silas, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "End her, end the children, and end my decade-long headache." Silas stood frozen, his face a mask of agony. He was unarmed, outnumbered. Any move he made would get them all killed. He was completely and utterly defeated. "There is no reason," Silas finally said, his voice hollow. "You've won." "I always win," Marcus replied with a smug smile. He gestured to his men. "Take them. Put the woman and children in the old holding cell beneath the saloon. The boy, bring him to my office. I want to have a final word with him before I dispose of him permanently." The men began to drag them away, back through the secret tunnel. Ilara fought, but it was useless. As they pulled her into the darkness, she locked eyes with Silas one last time. His face was a picture of brokenness, of failure. But then, just before the secret door swung shut, he did something strange. His eyes flicked down, just for a second, to the bead she had tucked into Lena's pocket earlier. Then he looked back at her and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a look of defeat. It was a signal. He had a plan, or at least the seed of one. It was the faintest glimmer of hope in an ocean of despair, but she clung to it. They dragged her down a dark, musty tunnel that smelled of damp earth and stale whiskey. It led directly into the cellar of the saloon, a place filled with barrels and crates. At the far end was a heavy iron door. They shoved her and the girls inside and slammed it shut, the heavy bolt sliding home with a sound of finality. The cell was pitch black, cold, and damp. Her daughters clung to her, sobbing in terror. Ilara held them tight, whispering reassurances she didn't feel. She thought about Silas's look. The bead. What did it mean? She reached into Lena's pocket and pulled it out. It was just a small clay bead, faded and worn. She ran her thumb over it. There was a small, sharp point on one side she'd never noticed before. It was a maker's mark, her grandmother's mark, a hawk's talon, the symbol of the women in her family, a symbol of resilience, of fighting back. But what could she do, locked in a stone cellar? Hours passed. The sounds from the saloon above, shouting, laughter, a tinny piano, filtered down to them, a mocking reminder of the world outside their prison. She and the girls huddled together for warmth, their hope dwindling with each passing moment. Then she heard a sound, a faint scratching. It was coming from the wall behind them. She pressed her ear to the cold stone. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. It was a pattern, a code. Her mind raced back to the stories her grandmother used to tell her. Stories about the Underground Railroad, not for slaves, but for her own people, hiding from the soldiers. They had used a secret language, a series of taps and scratches to communicate through walls, through floors. She had always thought they were just stories. The scratching came again, 2 quick scratches, a pause, then 3 more. It was a question. "Are you there?" Her heart leapt. Trembling, she found a loose stone on the floor and scratched back the answer. "Yes." The response was immediate. The scratches spelled out a message, slow and deliberate. "We hear you. The hawk's talon remembers its own. Do not fear. Help is coming." She wasn't alone. There were others. People loyal to her family's memory, hidden right here in Redemption, in the heart of their enemy's stronghold. A secret network, waiting for a sign. And somehow, Silas had activated it. The bead wasn't just a reminder. It was a signal. He must have found a way to show it to someone. Elias, the wagon driver? Someone else? A new wave of hope, fierce and powerful, surged through her. Marcus Kane thought he had won. He thought he had captured a helpless woman and her children. He had no idea he had just walked into a hornet's nest. Ilara hugged her daughters close, a real smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "Listen, my loves," she whispered into their hair. "Do you hear that? It's the song of our home, and it's coming to get us." In his father's opulent office above the saloon, Silas stared out the window at the squalor of Redemption. The sounds of his own beating echoed in his ears. Marcus hadn't held back. A cut was open on his cheek, and his ribs ached with every breath. "You're a fool, Silas," Marcus said, pouring himself a glass of expensive whiskey. "You had everything. Power, wealth, a legacy. You threw it all away for what? A misplaced sense of honor? For her?" "I threw it away because I saw what you are," Silas said, his voice raspy. "A thief and a murderer." Marcus sighed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Ownership is a matter of strength, my boy. Your grandfather understood that. I understand that. We take what we want. We hold what we can. That is the only law that matters. Your precious grant," he patted his coat pocket, "is just a piece of paper. The real power is in the will to use it. A will you've never had." He took a sip of whiskey. "I'm giving you one last chance. It pains me to destroy my only heir. Swear your loyalty to me now. Stand by my side and I will spare your life. I'll even find a place for your little savage and her brats. They can work in the kitchens." The offer was as vile as the man who made it. Silas turned from the window to face his father. He allowed a look of broken defeat to settle on his face. "And if I refuse?" "Then I will make you watch as Sheriff Thorne deals with them," Marcus said coldly. "And then I will hang you in the town square as a warning to any other traitors." Silas let out a long, shuddering breath, a perfect imitation of a man at the end of his rope. "All right," he whispered. "You win. I'll do as you ask." A slow, triumphant smile spread across Marcus Kane's face. He had broken him. Finally. "Excellent," he said. "I knew you'd see reason. Now, as a first sign of your renewed loyalty, you will tell me something. The girl. She's not the only one left, is she? There are others of her tribe, aren't there, hiding in these hills? I want to know where." This was the moment, the pivot. "There are," Silas said, keeping his head down. "A whole network. They call themselves the Hawk's Talon." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes glittering with greed. "And you know how to find them." "I do," Silas said. "They use a signal, a code. Elias, the driver, he taught it to me years ago. He had shown Elias the bead when he'd been arranging the transport. Elias had recognized the Hawk's Talon mark instantly and told him what to do if things went wrong." "Show me," Marcus demanded. Silas walked over to the thick oak desk. He tapped out a simple rhythm on the wood with his knuckles. Tap, 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 tap. It was a code meaning all clear, the target is secure. It was a lie. Marcus Kane watched, fascinated. "And that brings them?" "No," Silas said, looking up, his eyes no longer full of defeat, but of cold, hard fire. "That's the code to tell them you're a fool." Before Marcus could react, Silas exploded into action. He grabbed the heavy whiskey decanter from the desk and swung it, shattering it against his father's head. Marcus staggered back, dazed, glass and liquor spraying everywhere. Silas didn't hesitate. He launched himself at his father, tackling him to the ground. They crashed against a bookshelf, sending books flying. Marcus was strong, fueled by rage, but Silas was younger, faster, and driven by a decade of righteous fury. The fight was brutal, primal. A struggle not just for survival, but for the soul of the valley. As they wrestled on the floor, Silas's hand brushed against his father's coat. He felt the thick document inside, the grant. He ripped the coat open, seized the grant, and shoved it inside his own shirt. Just then, the office door burst open. Sheriff Thorne stood there, his gun drawn. "What in God's name?" He was cut off by a roar from outside. An explosion rocked the entire building, shattering the office window. Screams erupted from the street below. Thorne spun around, confused. "What was that?" It was all the distraction Silas needed. He slammed his elbow into his father's throat, knocking the wind out of him, then rolled away, coming to his feet. He looked at Thorne, a grim smile on his face. "That," he said, "is the Hawk's Talon." Down in the street, chaos had erupted. The front of the saloon had been blown open by a well-placed stick of dynamite. Men poured out, choking on smoke, only to be met by a silent, coordinated assault. Figures emerged from the alleyways, from the rooftops. Men and women. Some were Anglo, like Elias. Others were native, their faces painted with the symbol of a hawk. They moved with a deadly purpose, armed with rifles, bows, and knives. The secret network had been activated, and it was taking back the town. Sheriff Thorne stared in disbelief, then turned his gun on Silas. "You'll pay for this!" But before he could fire, an arrow sprouted from his chest. He gasped, looking down at it in surprise, and then crumpled to the floor. An old woman stood in the shattered doorway, a longbow in her hand. Her face was a mask of wrinkles, and her eyes burned with an ancient fire. It was Elias's sister, the woman they were supposedly visiting, the matriarch of the Hawk's Talon. "Go," she said to Silas, her voice like gravel. "Get the woman and the children. We'll handle this." Silas didn't need to be told twice. He raced out of the office, leaving his father gasping on the floor amidst the wreckage of his empire. The sounds of battle filled the air, gunshots, war cries, the clang of steel. The people of redemption were rising up. He sprinted down the back stairs to the cellar, the land grant pressed against his chest. He shot the bolt on the iron door and threw it open. Ilara stood there, her children behind her, her face illuminated by the chaos filtering down from above. She was no longer afraid. Her eyes were blazing. "I heard you were causing trouble," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "I had some help," he replied, his heart swelling. He looked at her, at this woman who had survived so much, who had fought a monster with a burning stick to protect her children. The woman who had trusted him even when he was the son of her enemy. He held out his hand. "Come on, let's go home." She took his hand, her grip firm and sure. Together, with their children, they ran from the prison, up into the smoke and the fire and the glorious sound of liberation. They were no longer running from the past. They were running toward their future. The battle for redemption was swift and decisive. Marcus Kane's hired guns were either captured or fled into the hills. The people, so long oppressed, fought with a ferocity born of desperation. When the smoke cleared, the town was theirs. Marcus Kane was dragged from his office, a broken man. His reign was over. The matriarch of the Hawk's Talon stood before him in the town square. "This land does not belong to you," she said, her voice echoing in the sudden silence. "It never did. You built your house on stolen ground, and now the earth itself has thrown you out." They didn't kill him. They exiled him. They put him on a horse with a single canteen of water and sent him east into the barren lands, a king with no kingdom. A fate, Ilara thought, worse than death. In the days that followed, the town of redemption was reborn. The palisade was torn down. The name was changed to something new. Dove's Landing. Silas stood with Ilara on the hill overlooking the valley, the newly repaired chapel behind them. The land grant, authenticated and filed with the territorial government, was safe. The valley, the spring, the land, it was all hers and her children's. The girls, Lena and Maya, were chasing butterflies in the meadow below, their laughter carrying on the wind. They were safe. They were home. "You did it," Ilara said softly, looking at Silas. "You atoned." "We did it," he corrected her, his eyes meeting hers. The guilt was still in his eyes, but it was joined by something else now. Peace and love. "This was always about you, about giving you back what was stolen." "You gave me back more than just my land," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave me back my hope." He reached out and gently touched her short hair. It was already starting to grow out. "Your hair will grow back," he said. "Your story was never in your braids. It's here." He pressed his palm gently against her chest, over her heart. "And it's the strongest story I've ever known." She leaned into his touch, the promise of forever, no longer a desperate whisper in the dark, but a solid, sun-drenched reality. She was no longer a burden. She was the heart of this land, the guardian of its future. And her children were not anchors, but the seeds from which a new generation would grow. She looked out over her home, the sun warming her face. The long, lonely road was finally at an end. This story is a powerful reminder that family isn't just about the blood you share, but about the people who stand with you, who fight for you, and who see you for who you truly are. It shows that even when you feel like a burden, you might actually be a blessing someone has been waiting their whole life to find. If you were moved by Alara's journey from despair to strength, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, and drop a comment below letting me know which moment of this incredible story hit you the hardest. Thanks for watching.